Alright, welcome everybody to this tutorial. So thank you to the member who requested this topic. We'll be going through analytical techniques today, but specifically chromatography and mass spec. So let's get right into it. So first we'll be talking about chromatography here, and you can see that I've copied the exact QCAA syllabus point from Unit 4 into this PowerPoint at the top. So it's to explain how proteins can be analyzed by chromatography and electrophoresis. So of course we won't be going through electrophoresis today, only chromatography specifically. It was mentioned that the theory and the concept behind chromatography was already understood, but I will still go through it at least briefly, just because it is going to be relevant to what you need to cover around chromatography. Okay, so let's begin. So this image that I've copied in is from the Chemistry Oxford textbook, and you can see that we have a column here with some circles inside. So this is what we call size exclusion chromatography, and as the name suggests, it's essentially a method to separate proteins based on their size, right? So we can see that in this first column here, we see that there's a solution of proteins that is being passed through a column with what we call resin or gel. So you may be when you work through this and like do some searches online, you might not be able to see the exact name size exclusion chromatography. It may be under, for example, gel filtration. So it's because you have this gel within the column that is used to filtrate whatever you're doing. So it might be under gel filtration chromatography when you're looking through this. So essentially what we see again, this protein mixture going through this column, and through this resin. So what we see, the resin here is essentially the material, or the gel in this case, that is the stationary phase in this column. And remember what the stationary phase is from learning it from last year chem. It's essentially what isn't moving, right? It's the one that stopped, right? And that's contrasted with the mobile phase, which is essentially the one that's moving. So back to resin. So the resin consists of these small porous beads, right? And it's essentially what interacts with the molecules, in this case proteins, in the actual sample. So we can see that as the sample moves through the column, you see that the resin essentially helps to separate these different sized molecules. So where the larger proteins at the end here, they can't fit in these porous beads essentially, and then what happens is they elute first, right? Because they're just too large to enter the pores, right? But the smaller proteins, they essentially get trapped in these small pores at the very beginning, right? And essentially, it's essentially at the end of the day, they get eluted last, as you can see. So they're essentially slightly delayed in getting eluted, so they get eluted relatively later. So you can see this is separating the proteins based on essentially molecular masses in a way, right? Because molecular masses is somewhat related to their size as well. So if you go over this textbook as well, you can see that they mention about being analyzed by UV light. So use UV visible spectrometry. It's also somewhat relevant, and I think you guys should know it because it is background to size exclusion chromatography. And UV is essentially just used to identify the proteins after this is done, because it essentially interacts. The UV rays interact with the amino acid side chains, and what differs an amino acid from another amino acid? Yes, it's a side chain, right? So you can use UV visible spectrometry after that to identify each of the proteins that have been eluted. So this is a very brief background. There is a little bit more detail that you might need to know for size exclusion chromatography, right? So the question was, that was proposed is, what exactly about chromatography is actually relevant to your chemistry syllabus? What is it that I need to know, right? And this is actually a really good question because it is slightly confusing, right? Because if you go through like your textbook, especially this Oxford one, they only mention about size exclusion. However, with the research that I've done, and with tutoring and things, I've noticed that, for example, this was on the 2021 QCAA external exam, and as you can see, TLC, that rhymed, thin layer chromatography. So this TLC, HPLC, so high performance liquid chromatography, these are things that were covered in the grade 11 syllabus. So you can see here that even though they were covered in the grade 11 syllabus, that knowledge is required for grade 12, right? Now, technically, you guys are told that you aren't tested on grade 11 content, but because I think the syllabus point is so vague, so general, by just saying analyzed by chromatography, you guys probably should remember your TLC and your HPLC stuff that you need to know. So in this case,